It seems like nothing stirs up a media controversy like profanity or perceived obscenity on TV. So let's take a look at some of the most intriguing situations that we've had recently and some of the court cases that have come out of them. Now, there are federal laws to protect people from viewing material that they may deem to be unsavory or offensive to them on the airwaves, and recognizing that unlike other forms of media, television and broadcasting in general come into your home, whether you want them to or not. I mean, owning a TV certainly is part of the criteria, and paying for cable if you choose to do such. But the fact is that these are transmissions that come in, and you are exposed to them in ways that you wouldn't be if you were self-selecting it, such as buying a newspaper or a magazine. So federal law prevents obscene programming from airing, any indecent programming, and it prevents profane language. But you may have noticed that profane language changes over time. So whereas it's fairly it used to be unacceptable to say the word damn on TV, now you can say certainly far worse. The FCC can actually revoke a station's license if they find they violate this. There's money involved here, pretty substantial funds. We have Howard Stern pictured here, who of course has been exposed to some pretty significant fines for his behavior on the radio. Or, it can issue a warning to the station if it feels like it has material that has aired perhaps accidentally in some way. So again, obscenity, let's just remember that it's the average person applying contemporary community standards. So contemporary standards change, and it's fairly well known that, in the 50s when the Lucille Ball show was on TV, it was one of the edgier shows, and actually Lucille Ball had a baby, and it was a very big deal, the idea that she was pregnant and had a baby on TV. Now we can pretty much see full frontal nudity and on television, on HBO and the like. True Blood was the closest thing to porn that we're going to see on conventional television, and so that's a way of just recognizing how community standards will change, and recognizing that what is a prurient interest today will certainly change over time. The material must also depict, as we know, or describe something that's patently offensive, sexual conduct specifically as defined by applicable law, and then taken as a whole, it has to lack serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. So, a lot of these same things are going to come up, and we're going to have to kind of apply them to these the restrictions that we face on broadcast. So, this, of course, is Janet Jackson and Justin Timberlake, and we all know what happened with her wardrobe malfunction. There actually was a fairly substantial fine that was levied because of this Super Bowl halftime show. It was later reduced, but the point is that we're looking at how people judge indecency, and this was considered to be indecent. It was a violation of broadcast standards, and based on the criteria of what we see here for indecency and what we saw for obscenity, this is how we judge these things. Now, the fact still remains, though, that a lot of indecent material is protected by the First Amendment, so it can't be banned entirely. So what we do from a broadcast standpoint is we restrict the times of day when children may be watching. So things that you can put on 10 o'clock and beyond are different than the things that you can put on during the daylight hours or during what we consider to be prime time viewing hours. So between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. Are basically there are indecency enforcement actions that can take place. Now, I have a picture here for you of the show NYPD Blue. It was one of those shows that appeared at 10 o'clock and started to push the envelope early in the 90s, where they actually showed a man's naked rear end. That was revolutionary for TV at the time. So when you think about now how often we see, simulated sex or, things that come quite close to nudity, remember that as early as 1990, this was, or the early 90s, this was considered to be absolutely revolutionary. Now, profane broadcast restrictions are looking at language that is so grossly offensive to people of the public that it amounts to a nuisance. This is when we deal with things that are on radio and TV, again, between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. Now, we look at this kind of profanity, the restrictions are based on these kind of complaints that we receive from the public. The FCC actually reviews these complaints to determine whether or not there's enough information that there's been a violation. And they can result in what we have here, a notice of apparent liability, that the FCC rules have been broken. Again, you can have pretty substantial fines and suspension of licenses. Now, I picture here George Carlin, who is the most well-known profane comic, perhaps, because of his monologue on 7 dirty words. He said that there are 7 words that you absolutely cannot say. We have the video up on our iTunes U course. I will show this video in class for you to get a feel for what words he was talking about. But he took it pretty far, and we'll see what happens. So this case, FCC versus Pacifica, had to do with this weekly broadcast. It was a New York radio station that aired George Carlin's monologue, Filthy Words. And the station warned listeners that it was going to include some pretty sensitive language. But the FCC got a complaint who said that this gentleman was driving with his young son when he heard this language. And when you listen to the recording, you'll understand why he may have been pretty sensitive to that. So the question before the court was, does the First Amendment deny the government the power to restrict public broadcasting of indecent language under any circumstance? And the conclusion of the court was no, that limited civil sanctions could be invoked against a radio broadcast of patently offensive words that especially dealt with sex or bodily functions. The words don't have to be obscene to warrant the sanction, but the audience, the medium, the time of day, all of those things were relevant in determining whether or not they could invoke sanctions. Now, we continue to struggle with this issue. You can see the FCC is party in another case here, FCC versus Fox TV, because the FCC said in 2004 that any TV station could be fined for what they said were indecency violations in cases when vulgarity was broadcast during a live program. So in 2002 and 2003, we had instances where Cher, pictured here, and Nicole Richie cursed during award shows, and it was not bleeped out. So Fox wasn't fined, but the network was worried about the idea of future fines, and so they filed a motion here, and the U.S. Court of Appeals ruled the FCC's rules were what they called unconstitutionally vague and had a chilling effect. So what the Supreme Court had to decide was, did the Court of Appeals err in finding that the FCC's indecency policy was unconstitutionally vague in its entirety? And they said no. The FCC standards as they were applied were vague, and that they didn't give proper notice to broadcasters they'd be fined for these kind of fleeting expletives that come out in the heat of an excited moment. So Anthony Kennedy actually noted that the court didn't decide whether the practice violated the First Amendment or whether indecency policy itself was unconstitutional, only how it was applied in this particular case.